You've seen the painting 1,000 times. Long table, upright chairs, soft white bread. Jesus and 12 men seated in perfect symmetry, faces calm, everything clean and lit like a stage. Leonardo da Vinci gave us that image in 1498, and it's been burned into our minds ever since, reproduced in Sunday school rooms, tourist shops, dorm room posters. But here's the problem. Nearly every detail is wrong. The table was low. There were no chairs. The bread was flat and dense, torn by hand, never sliced. And they weren't sitting upright in neat rows. They were lying on their sides, packed shoulder to shoulder on cushions, close enough to hear each other breathing. What you think you know about the Last Supper comes from Renaissance Italy, not 1st century Judea. And when you strip away the paint and rebuild that room as it actually was, with the real food, the real customs, the sweat and lamp oil and proximity, the whole scene transforms. This isn't about tearing down something sacred. It's about making it real. Because when you understand what they actually ate, how they actually reclined, and why every gesture mattered in ways we've forgotten, the story doesn't become smaller. It becomes more human, more intimate, and somehow more powerful. Let's tear down that painting and rebuild the room from the ground up. Start with the most obvious lie: the furniture. Da Vinci painted a high table with chairs. Jesus and the disciples sit upright, feet on the ground, hands resting neatly. It looks like a formal dinner party in a Florentine palazzo. But by the 1st century, urban Jews, especially for formal meals like Passover, had adopted the Greco-Roman dining custom. They reclined, not on chairs, on low couches arranged in a U shape around a low table. You lay on your left side, propped on cushions, your right arm free for eating. Your feet extended away from the table, not tucked underneath. And the person next to you wasn't across the table. They were right behind you, close enough that their head was near your chest. We know this from archaeology. Excavations at Qumran, at wealthy homes in Jerusalem, show dining rooms with plastered benches along the walls where people reclined. The Gospel of John says the disciple Jesus loved was reclining next to him, and later, leaning back against Jesus. That only makes physical sense if they're lying nearly head to chest. This wasn't casual. Reclining was a statement. Slaves and servants stood or sat. Free people reclined. And at Passover specifically, reclining symbolized freedom, a ritual reminder that your ancestors were once enslaved, but you are not. So when Jesus and the 12 gathered in that upper room, they weren't sitting in chairs like board members. They were lying on their sides, bodies pressed close, in a posture that forced intimacy. Now the bread. In the painting, you see round, soft loaves that look like dinner rolls. 1st century Palestinian bread was nothing like that. It was flat, dense, unleavened for Passover, meaning no yeast, no rise, just flour and water mixed fast and slapped onto the hot wall of a clay oven. It came out stiff, slightly charred, with a smoky bite. Think of a thick cracker, not sandwich bread. Women ground the grain every morning using heavy stones, an hour or more of repetitive labor just to make the day's flour. Then they mixed it with water, sometimes a little olive oil and salt, and baked it fresh. Because in that heat, without preservatives, bread went stale within a day. And bread wasn't a side dish. It was the meal. The Hebrew word for bread, lechem, was used interchangeably with the word for food in general. Everything else, olive oil, vegetables, fish, if you were lucky, was just there to make the bread go down easier. When Jesus broke bread at the Last Supper, he wasn't cutting a loaf with a knife. He was tearing flat matzah with his hands, the way every Jewish host had done for centuries. That tearing was the signal. The meal begins. The blessing is given. Now we eat together. And together meant something specific. There were no individual plates. You didn't get your own portion served separately. Bread was torn and passed. Dishes were shared. Everyone dipped into the same bowl. That's the next thing the painting gets wrong: the separation. Da Vinci gives each figure space, individual cups, a sense of personal boundaries. The real meal had none of that. When you reclined in a triclinium and ate from common bowls, you were in constant physical contact. Shoulders touched. You reached across someone to dip your bread. You smelled the person next to you: sweat, wool, olive oil, lake water if they were fishermen. This was the context when Jesus dipped bread and handed it to Judas. Not a formal gesture from across a table. He was close enough to touch, close enough to place the morsel directly into Judas's hand. And that gesture, giving someone a piece of dipped bread, was a sign of honor and affection. The other disciples didn't even understand it as a betrayal signal. They thought Jesus was telling Judas to go buy something or give money to the poor, because sharing food like that meant friendship. When you see it this way, the closeness, the shared bowls, the torn bread, the reclining bodies, you realize how much intimacy that room held, and how much the betrayal violated. This wasn't a ceremony, it was dinner, and everything we think we know needs to be rebuilt from there. Jesus wasn't wealthy, neither were the men around him. That matters more than you'd think, because in the first century, what you ate wasn't about preference, it was about economics. And Jesus came from the kind of background where meals were fuel, not luxury. The Gospels call him a tekton. For centuries, that was translated carpenter. But the word meant something broader: builder, craftsman, construction worker. Someone who worked with wood and stone, doing manual labor in a world where most people lived just above subsistence. Nazareth, where he grew up, was a village of maybe 200 people. No wealth, no industry, just families scratching survival from rocky hillsides. Nearby, Sepphoris was being rebuilt during his youth, a Roman project that probably pulled in local laborers. That's likely where men like Jesus found work, hauling stone, shaping beams, the kind of labor that left your hands calloused and your back sore. His disciples weren't much different. Peter, Andrew, James, John, fishermen, not boat owners running an empire, but men who worked nets on the Sea of Galilee, hauling catches, salting fish, mending gear. Matthew had been a tax collector, which gave him a bit more money, but made him despised. Simon might have been tied to anti-Roman resistance. Judas carried the group's communal money bag, which tells you they pooled what little they had. These were working men, and working men ate working-class food. That meant bread as the foundation of every meal. Barley bread if money was tight, cheaper than wheat, coarser, considered inferior. Olive oil for dipping, lentil stew when you could make it. Fish if you lived near the lake or could afford dried sardines. Wine, always watered down, because untreated water could make you sick. Meat, rarely. Animals were worth more alive. Sheep gave you wool. Goats gave you milk. Cattle pulled plows. Slaughtering one meant losing future production, so you only did it for something significant. A wedding, a major festival, or because the law required it. For Passover, the law required lamb. Every household had to sacrifice one at the temple, then take it home to roast. That was the exception. The rest of the year, if you were a laborer, you didn't eat meat. You ate what kept you alive and cost the least. This is the background that shaped the Last Supper. Not a catered banquet, not a priest's table. A Passover meal shared by men whose daily diet was bread, oil, and whatever else they could afford that week. Jesus grew up eating like this. He worked for it. His disciples worked for it. And when they gathered that night in Jerusalem, the food reflected exactly who they were. Men from the edges, the working poor, whose bodies knew hunger and hard labor, and whose last meal together was the kind of meal their mothers and wives had made 1,000 times before. Food wasn't neutral, not in first-century Judea. Every meal was a declaration of who you were, whose laws you followed, which God you served. And under Roman occupation, when imperial culture pressed in from every side, the choice to eat this and not that became an act of resistance. Jewish dietary law drew lines, hard ones. No pork, no shellfish, only fish with fins and scales, no mixing meat and dairy. Animals had to be slaughtered in specific ways, blood drained completely, because consuming blood was forbidden. It belonged to God alone. These weren't suggestions, they were identity, written into Leviticus and Deuteronomy, passed down for centuries. And by the time Jesus walked those roads, they separated Jews from everyone around them. Romans ate pork regularly. Greek culture celebrated feasts where anything went. Refusing those meals marked you as different, and sometimes brought mockery, suspicion, even danger. But that was the point. Food was covenant made visible. 3 times a day, every day, observant Jews said through their meals, "We are set apart." There were no grocery stores, no imports shipped from distant coasts, no refrigerated trucks bringing strawberries in winter or salmon from another continent. You ate what grew within walking distance, and where you lived determined what that was. Galilee, in the north, was the fertile exception. Higher rainfall, rich soil. The Sea of Galilee, a freshwater lake 13 miles long, teeming with fish. Wheat and barley grew in fields that could produce surplus. Olive groves covered the hillsides. Fig trees, date palms, grapevines, onions, leeks, cucumbers, lentils, chickpeas. If you lived in Galilee, you had options. Not wealth, necessarily, but variety. Enough rain to grow food, enough fish to salt and trade. Jesus spent most of his ministry here, in villages where bread was reliable and protein came from the lake. Judea, to the south, was harder, rockier, drier. Jerusalem sat at 2,500 feet, surrounded by hills that required terracing just to grow anything. 12 inches of rain a year, maybe 16 in a good season. Cisterns collected every drop because there were no rivers, no lakes. Grain often had to be imported. Livestock, sheep, goats, became more important because the land couldn't support crops the way Galilee could. Olive trees survived in the terraces, grapevines clung to the slopes, but food security was precarious. One bad harvest, and people went hungry. This is why geography wasn't just scenery, it was the menu, and it split the country into two food worlds. But everywhere, rich or poor, north or south, three things formed the foundation: grain, olive oil, and wine. The Mediterranean triad, the caloric backbone of every ancient diet. Grain, mostly wheat and barley, provided 50 to 70% of daily calories. Olive oil was the only fat used for cooking, fuel, medicine, everything. Wine, always diluted, was safer than water and provided hydration plus calories. Everything else, vegetables, fish, meat, fruit, was secondary. Important, yes, but supplemental. The triad kept you alive. Bread wasn't a side dish, it was the meal. Modern meals center on protein, meat, fish, something substantial, and bread just accompanies it. The ancient world worked in reverse. Bread was the foundation. Everything else was opsin, a Greek word meaning relish, the thing that makes bread easier to eat. Women ground grain every morning using heavy basalt stones, an hour or more of repetitive work just to produce enough flour for the day. They mixed it with water, sometimes a little olive oil, a pinch of salt if they had it. Then they shaped it and baked it in clay ovens or on hot stones. It had to be made fresh. In that climate, without preservatives, bread went stale within a day. So every morning, the sound of grinding stones. Every day, the smell of baking. The Hebrew word lechem meant bread, but it also meant food in general. The two were inseparable. To ask for bread was to ask for a meal. To be without bread was to be starving, and bread was never cut, always torn. The host took the loaf, flat, round, dense, and tore it by hand. That tearing signaled the meal's beginning. It was the gesture of provision, of authority, of welcome. You broke bread, and then you shared it. This wasn't symbolic, it was literal. Bread came in one piece, and breaking it meant everyone ate from the same loaf. That created something immediate: connection. The phrase, breaking bread, didn't mean having a meal in some abstract sense. It meant the physical act of tearing and passing. At Passover, the bread was matzah, unleavened, made without yeast, baked fast, flat and dense, more like a thick cracker than anything soft. It symbolized the haste of the Exodus, when there was no time to let dough rise. When Jesus broke matzah at the Last Supper and said, "This is my body," everyone in that room knew what breaking bread meant. They'd done it 1,000 times. But now he was rewriting the script, taking the most ordinary gesture and filling it with something new. And then there was olive oil. If bread was the foundation, olive oil was the glue holding the diet together. It wasn't optional. It was essential, used for everything. Olives were harvested in late autumn by beating the trees with poles. The fruit was crushed in stone presses, the oil extracted in stages. First pressing produced the finest oil, used for eating. Later pressings, sometimes with heated water, produced lower grades for lamps and soap. Every household stored oil in large clay jars. You cooked with it, dipped bread in it, burned it in lamps after dark, treated wounds with it. There's a reason the Good Samaritan parable mentions oil and wine for binding injuries. You even anointed with it in religious rituals and as a sign of hospitality. At meals, olive oil sat in a shared bowl at the center. Everyone dipped their bread into it. Often it was mixed with herbs, hyssop, sumac, sesame, the ancient version of za'atar. Sometimes just oil and salt, dipping into the same bowl, created intimacy. Physical closeness, your hand and someone else's reaching into the same space over and over. It required trust. No one worried about poison or contamination because you were eating together from the same source. This is the context when Jesus dipped bread and gave it to Judas. Not a separate gesture, isolated and strange. He reached into the shared bowl, soaked a piece of matzah in oil or charosé, and handed it directly to Judas. In that culture, giving someone a dipped piece of bread was an honor, a sign of favor. The host offering a choice morsel to a guest. It meant closeness, affection, friendship. That's what makes the betrayal so bitter. Judas accepted the bread. He ate it, and then he walked out into the night to sell his teacher for 30 pieces of silver. The gesture that should have meant love became the trigger for death. Fish was common if you lived near water. Meat was not. That distinction mattered because protein, the thing modern diets assume as a given, was expensive, sporadic, and for most people came from sources that had nothing to do with animals. In Galilee, fish were everywhere. The Sea of Galilee wasn't actually a sea. It was a freshwater lake, 13 miles long, fed by the Jordan River. And it was full of life. Tilapia, called musht in Aramaic, later nicknamed St. Peter's fish by Christian tradition. Sardines, caught by the thousands in drag nets and salted for preservation. Larger carp-like species. The lake supported an entire economy. Families who fished, traders who salted and dried the catch, merchants who shipped it inland to Jerusalem and beyond. If you lived in Capernaum or Bethsaida, you had access to fresh fish regularly, grilled over open flame, salted and stored, affordable, reliable protein. The disciples who were fishermen, Peter, Andrew, James, John, ate better than most, not because they were rich, but because they worked the water. Their hands smelled like fish, their boats reeked of it, and their bodies ran on it. Salted sardines could last months. Dried fish traveled well. Preservation methods meant even inland towns could buy fish, though it cost more the farther you went from the lake. But meat, that was different. Animals were valuable alive. A sheep gave you wool every year. A goat gave you milk. A cow pulled your plow. Slaughtering one meant losing all future production, and most families couldn't afford that loss except for something major. Weddings, religious festivals, Passover, when the law required it. The cost of a lamb for Passover could equal a week's wages or more. You didn't eat that kind of meal casually. You ate it because God commanded it, once a year, and the whole family shared one animal because wasting any of it was unthinkable. The rest of the year, if you were working class, your protein came from lentils. Lentils, chickpeas, broad beans, these were the backbone, cheap, storable, reliable. You could dry them and keep them for months. Boil them into stew with onions, garlic, olive oil, maybe some herbs if you had them. Lentil stew wasn't glamorous. It was peasant food, the kind of thing wealthy people looked down on. But it worked. Legumes plus grain gave you complete protein, all the amino acids your body needed. That combination sustained entire populations for millennia. Jesus and his disciples ate lentils constantly. They just don't show up in the stories because they were too ordinary to mention. At the Last Supper, there was lamb, roasted whole, required by Passover law. But that wasn't their normal meal. That was the exception, the one night a year when even the poor ate meat because the covenant demanded it. Bread was torn by hand, never cut. Breaking bread wasn't poetic language. It was the literal act that began every meal, the host taking the loaf, tearing it with both hands and passing pieces around the room. That gesture carried weight. It signaled provision, authority, welcome. When you broke bread and gave it to someone, you were saying, "I feed you. You belong here. We eat together." And eating together meant something specific in that world. It created fellowship, temporary kinship, a bond of trust and shared life. Accepting broken bread from someone's hand meant entering their peace. This is why Jesus' words at the Last Supper hit so hard. He took the matzah, broke it the way every Jewish host had done for centuries, and said, "This is my body." Understanding the food changes everything. But understanding what food meant, that's what makes the Last Supper impossible to forget. In the ancient world, meals weren't just nutrition. They were identity, hierarchy, theology, and belonging, all performed 3 times a day. Every bite carried meaning. Every shared dish was a statement. Who you ate with defined who you were. The Last Supper wasn't painted on a wall in soft light. It happened in a rented room that smelled like roasted lamb and lamp oil, packed with men whose hands were greasy and whose bodies pressed close on cushions they'd been lying on for hours. Real bread, torn rough, real wine, watered down, real intimacy. The kind that comes when you're shoulder to shoulder, dipping into the same bowls, close enough to hear breathing. And real betrayal, delivered with a gesture that should have meant friendship. Understanding the history doesn't make it less sacred. It makes it human, achingly, powerfully human. Because God didn't meet them in abstractions. He met them at the table, with bread in his carpenter's hands.